Welcome to this Brimbank Writers and Readers event. This event is being held on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners and pay my respects to their elders past and present. The Brimbank Writers and Readers Festival is an annual event that encourages a love of reading, literature and storytelling. It celebrates creativity and diversity and promotes lifelong learning in Brimbank. Brimbank City Council is delighted to present the online Brimbank Writers and Readers Festival, a partnership between Brimbank Libraries and the Bowery Online. We'd also like to thank our key sponsor, Victoria University. Okay, welcome Carmel. Thanks for joining us on Zoom in this time of lockdown again.
Hi Sherryl, thanks very much for having me here, and I'm glad we can actually do it at least.
Yeah, the wonders of technology.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm going to start by asking you about your book. Tell us a little bit about it and little plot summary.
Essentially, it's about a family in the wake of trauma. It's told in two different time frames. One is in the present day, where we're with the daughter, who's now a grown woman with a family, and she's told by the police that her brother, who it turns out she hasn't seen for 20 years, has been injured in an accident. And so that provokes a whole lot of questions about what's happened and why hasn't she seen him, and why is she now reluctant to see him. And so then it moves back into the past, where we're in a small town in northern country Victoria, and we kind of discover all of the events that happened to really separate these two siblings. So that's the kind of guts of it, I suppose. The story's told in the present. It's told through the eyes of Laurie, who was a teenager in the 90s and is now grown. And back in the 90s, it's told mostly through the eyes of the mother of the family, whose name is Pam, but we have occasional segues into the local town cop, who also tells some of the story, and that's a little bit to kind of keep you at arm's length from what's happened to the family during that time. So,
hence the title, Life Before.
Yes, that's right. That was life before, and now there's life now. Yeah.
So can you remember what the idea was that sparked the story? Because it's complex. As you say, it moves backwards and forwards in time. So what was the initial kind of concept and how did it develop?
This had started life as a short story, and I think it probably just came from my own experiences growing up in a rural setting, small town, some of the things that happened. I mean, because this does centre around a vehicle accident, I mean, those sorts of things were probably still are, I'm sure, quite commonplace in rural towns, and the kind of reverberations that these sort of things can have through communities is really quite strong. So I had started it out as a short story, and it was really just centred around Laurie, but I could never really get it to work properly. And then I realised it actually needed to have another layer to it. And then when I added the other layer, I thought that layer has to have more depth than just this story about this girl and her past. It has to have some big backstory in that past to have made her what she is, and also just to give depth to the story. So in terms of that part, I think at the time when I was writing this, which was probably the short story, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, there seemed to be a spate of accidents that were reported in the paper at the time, where usually young men driving cars full of their friends had an accident, and one of or two of their friends died. And I just kept thinking, what would it be like to be that person, to carry that kind of guilt? How could you deal with your life, and what would happen to all the families? That whole ripple effect of not just you, not even just the person who died, but the other people in the car, or the people who, respond to the accident, the whole thing. And in a small town, as I know you know, Sherryl, these things are really magnified, 100-fold. So, yeah, that's kind of where that part of it all came from. It wasn't until Pam put the washing on that she noticed spots of blood on the top of his shirt sleeve. She might have thought it was a cut or a scratch if it hadn't been for the strange shape, suggesting something of a circular outline. She went into his room and pulled back the bedclothes. There was a smear of something dark against his pillow and a piece of gauze lying on the side of his bed. Pam looked at the amassed evidence like a detective. There was only one conclusion, and a shocking one at that. A tattoo. He'd got a tattoo. Why the hell would he have done that? After her brief moment of satisfaction a few months before, the revelation that he was indeed thinking about his future and seemed intent on continuing in the right direction, well, any direction, this came as a slap, a neat reminder that he was indeed still impulsive.
I wanted to ask you, Carmel, about your writing process for this novel. So are you a plotter and outliner, or are you a pantser? Do you like to just follow your ideas wherever they go?
Well, I'm a bit of both, really. I actually really like to know the end before I begin, so at least I know where I'm heading with something. But in terms of how it's actually written, with this novel and other things I've done, it's a bit of both. So sometimes I'll have a bit of a plot for sections and not for others, or something vague and overarching. But I'm also very willing to just let that go and see where things take me as well. So it really does depend. I found with my other paid work that I'm often asked to supply, quite detailed outlines of things before I write them, and I've discovered that a lot of the time I don't necessarily stick to those, although there'll always be a sort of general outline that I will stay with. But there's something about the actual writing of something. You can have an idea of how things might go, and you can have an idea of how things might fit together, but when you're actually writing them, it often doesn't translate. Something will come up, or there'll be a new angle, or some little niggling question that wasn't answered before, and you realise that you can't stick to that way of being.
So what was your writing process in terms of, are you disciplined? Do you write for a certain amount of time each day, or how do you fit it in?
Well, because I write for a living, I have to be disciplined with that. So I do treat it pretty much as an office job. But I also, because working from home, you get cabin fever. I like to kind of plan little escapes from the house every now and then. So sometimes I'll swap time around, and I don't really like to work on the weekends, but occasionally I might do that. So that is a bit more structured in general. But with my writing for myself projects, they just fit in around everything else. And that I find is the difficult bit, because if I'm really busy with work, it's very hard to get the same kind of mental energy up to write something else. Because I don't know, that I'm sure you find this too, that there's a certain sort of mental space that you have to be in to write. And even, my paid work writing, and a lot of that's fiction too, it sort of does put me in that place. And then if I'm trying to do something for myself at the end of the day, it often is just mush. So it's hard. So actually I have to rely on times when I'm not really working and then try and make sure that I have the impetus to just get on with it. So I guess I've done the best work on this novel when I've had a month or two where I haven't had other work on. Sometimes especially with writing for yourself, I think you've got these sort of moments that are, they're kind of barriers to where you want to go with your work, and you have to work through them. Like, you have to just be really hard on yourself and disciplined and write until you get through this point. And I think sometimes that's hard to do without just, an absolute push. So there's all sorts of little psychological issues, I guess, that happen. And just the fact that, writing can just be really hard work sometimes.
So how much research did you do for this novel? What particularly did you have to go and find out about?
There were two lots of research that I did, legal and medical. One was because the character was in a coma, and I just needed to know that his transition, I suppose, through unconsciousness and regaining consciousness would be something that would be ballpark. And that was actually quite hard to research, because I read lots of people's stories of being in comas and coming out of them and whatever. And there are so many different things that can happen to people, but in some ways that's not such a bad thing. It did mean that it was also allowed me to be able to play with time frames a little bit. And the other was around legal stuff, just researching issues about dangerous driving and culpable driving, and arrest procedures and court procedures, not because I needed to know them in detail, but just to make sure that the time frame worked and the kinds of things that would have happened to the person in question would have been feasible. So yeah, it wasn't to sort of set anything in cement with that, but just to make sure that people weren't reading it and thinking, oh, would that have happened?
With the research that you do for your novels and your children's educational work, what's the weirdest or the strangest or most interesting thing you've had to research?
There are so many things that you come across and just completely astounded by, or you just learn so much about different places and countries. And I've never been much into science, but I've had to write a few sciencey kind of books over the years, and learning about space and planets and things like that, which it just makes you reconceptualize who you are in some ways when you see yourself in relation to the whole universe, just this absolutely tiny little speck of being. So there are things like that I suppose make you feel very in awe of life, and just finding out about different cultures, a lot about the environment. I've written quite a lot of books on the environment and the awful things that happen in our environment, and just life in general around the planet and how it's so different for so many people. So all of those things are kind of amazing and occasionally rather depressing, but we have hope.
So how's your next book going? Can you tell us a little tiny bit about it?
Well, it's my next book is it's probably about halfway through, but and I had hoped actually with COVID-19 when lockdown that I might have a bit more time to write, but actually I've been busy with my other work, which has probably been a good thing because it gives me a distraction. Because I think it's actually quite a hard time to write at the moment, although I guess as we're getting more used to this new way of living, our mental spaces are perhaps accommodating that. But I don't know when I'll get to finish it, because I need a chunk of time which I can, not be distracted by the news or.
The question about books, I've got two. First of all, the 5 books you would take to a desert island.
Well, I'd probably take pretty much anything by Kate Atkinson, but I really like her Jackson Brodie series. So Jackson Brodie is a private detective, and she's written, I think, 5 books in that series now. So that kind of fulfills both the detective and serious novel category. She's also written some other more serious novels that don't fit in that category. I'd take any of those. A God in Ruins are great books. I would take Jennifer Egan, A Visit from the Goon Squad, which I think won the Pulitzer Prize in 2005 or thereabouts. Another American writer, Richard Ford, who has written a trilogy of books around a failed real estate agent called Frank Bascom, and the second one of that's called Independence Day, and I think that's an absolutely terrific novel. Glenn Duncan, who's a British writer who's hardly anyone has ever heard of and is very underrated, but Death of an Ordinary Man is one of my favourites. But these days he writes books about vampires and werewolves, I think because he wanted to earn a living because no one was reading his novels. And Tim Winton's Breath, which is a really fantastic novel. And actually I was thinking that all of those, probably with the exception of a couple of the Kate Atkinsons and maybe Independence Day, but they're all not too long, those books. They're all kind of like reasonable sized books. They're not like great big bricks. So I don't know whether they'd last me that long on a desert island, but, good reads. And I think you wanted to know about crime.
Yes, for all our keen crime reading library members, your best crime recommendations.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's so many, but I guess I'll just list them quickly so that I've got down here Ian Rankin, Henning Mankell, Tana French, and Kate Atkinson and her Jackson Brodie novels. I think we've got some great writers in Australia as well. So Gary Disher, I love, Emma Biskick, yourself, Jeannie Green. I think, there's a lot of good crime writers around, and a lot of ways that we can pass the time with some good crime books.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us today. So thanks for answering all of those questions. Also thank Brimbank City Council and our sponsors, Victoria University. So join us for the next one.
Thanks very much for having me.